Gordon. He's a very highly experienced IT professional architect, deep experience from across a huge range of different organisations, both product organisations, consultancies such as ourselves, and enterprise, in particular in health, education, amongst a host of others. So Gordon specialises in integration and surprisingly data, and has a very deep interest in AI, which we will take pleasure hearing about. And of course, he's really passionate about sharing his expertise. So I will stop talking and hand over to Gordon. Thank you all for attending this lunch.
Cool. So thank you, Carl. Hopefully a slide deck is being shared right now. Just a little bit of background to this presentation. It's one I gave to the internal Cyma group a short while ago, and it got a little bit of interest. So I thought, let's take the opportunity to share it a bit more widely. Now, this is not a technical session. We're not going to be getting into anything deep in the technology. There's maybe a diagram, a few graphs, but broadly speaking, this is a topic that is of importance to everybody. And I think, we're not going to get deep into technology. So without further ado, moving on with the presentation. So just a quick agenda. We'll start with an introduction and some key concepts. We'll talk about what we actually mean by bias. These parts I want to get through very, very quickly because the history to this presentation is really around a book that I read. I do a lot of reading. I read this book and thought this is a really important thing that needs to be shared more broadly. It's not a topic that should be ignored. And so I used this opportunity to get to that book. So the meat of the presentation is around that book, but as a lead-in, we talk about some examples. We talk about that specific example of generative AI because it is so topical at the moment. But then I introduced the idea of entrenched and secondary bias. So the idea that some bias flows on from an initial piece of bias so that it is not necessarily obvious when you're looking at data sets. Then I get into that recommended reading, the piece where I'm talking about that book that I read. The book has a single central thesis, and then countless examples of how that thesis plays out in real life. And so a lot of the presentation is going through just a handful of examples from the book. The book has dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of this bias playing out. And then just towards the end, I'm looking at, well, okay, what can we do about this bias? And then I'll open up for questions and discussions as time allows. As Carl said, I do encourage conversation throughout the presentation, but just with so many people and so many people working remotely, I think it's going to work better if we can just do that in a coordinated way through the chat mechanism, or possibly just by sticking your hand up. I know architects love to talk and it can derail these things. So without further ado, what do we actually mean by bias? So this is a definition that I found online. It's one that works for me. Hopefully it is fairly clear. It's just that notion that when we're looking at data, when we're looking at anything in the world, it's affected by our own experiences and our own internal mental processes. And sometimes those are specific to an individual, but more often they are generalized across sections of society. And those societal biases can be reflected in data, and there's no avoiding it. But it's a thing that has to be borne in mind when you're actually trying to work with that data. It's idealistic to assume that data is an absolute representation of truth. The bias is always going to be there. We just have to find ways of dealing with it, and we have to know that it's there. And that's what this presentation is about, is looking at how bias plays out, and it's using one specific example of bias, probably the most entrenched and pervasive case of bias that is in all human society. And using that as a case study. Just as a bit of a lead-in, I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of bias coming out of the generative AI world, and ones that are, I guess, high profile in terms of they hit the popular press. They're things that will be known to the public at large. The first example I want to give is around foodstuffs. So foodstuffs, and my apologies if there's any people that work for foodstuffs on the call. This is not meant to draw attention to anything in particular with foodstuffs. And in some ways, the way that they dealt with this situation was really, really good, but it is about them. So foodstuffs are trying facial recognition software. This is a necessary step for them because they're trying to combat the steady increase in both retail theft and also bad behavior, that phenomenon of customers treating staff in supermarkets really, really badly that arose under COVID, but has continued in the present day. So the way it works is that digital images of shoppers are captured and compared against a database of what they call trespassed individuals using facial recognition. There are human safeguards that wrap this process. So when a match is found against that list of trespassed individuals, senior staff member are meant to confer. So it's not with a single individual, it's with a number of them, and they confront that individual. Facial recognition is based on images that are captured off the internet. In other words, this is a international model, not a New Zealand model, and it's used, it's used a vast number of images, but those images are from around the world. And the nature of bias is such that those images are predominantly from Western nations and wealthier nations. A well-known phenomenon with those facial recognition models is that they favour white faces over coloured ones. For New Zealand in particular, the number of Maori reflected in those models is going to be very, very small. Even though there are huge numbers of images used to build up those models, Maori are a sufficiently small group on a global scale that they're not going to be a large proportion of the faces in those facial recognition models. As a result, in April of this year, Foodstuffs had their first false positive off of this system. The manual systems did not work appropriately, and a Maori woman who was entirely innocent of being a trespassed person was the person caught up by that process. She was just there trying to buy some things for her birthday, and the whole thing turned into a fiasco in which she was confronted by staff and asked to leave the premises. And this was a major problem and something of a black eye for Foodstuffs. Foodstuffs did make the claim that this was a case of human error, that it was the conferring and confirmation stage that failed, but they do have to be acknowledged that there's only so much that you can do in those human processes given the kind of typical pay that you would have for supermarket employees. So this is an example where bias has played out in a New Zealand context relatively recently with bad consequences both for the individuals affected but also for the organisation that was making it. For my second example, I'm going to go back in time a little bit and talk about an experiment that Microsoft carried out in 2016 around a bot that would operate on Twitter. This is the Tay chatbot. Tay was a chatbot interacting with end users in Twitter. The idea was that this would be done as an experiment to see what would happen if a chatbot was allowed to be effectively trained in real time. So Tay affected the persona of a young woman new to the world, trying to understand how things were going on. And the way that Tay worked was that it would use the prompts entered into it to evolve her own model. So needless to say, the internet being what it is and the naivety of organizations being a lot more than what it is now, the trolls immediately realized that how Tay could be used. They trained her with highly inflammatory messages, and within hours, Tay was responding to perfectly legitimate and ordinary queries with the most hateful kinds of replies that you could imagine. My original version of this presentation used the actual screenshots from Tay's tweets, but the marketing department have wisely cautioned against sharing those things here, so I've just blurred them out and put in placeholders. But yeah, Tay lasted a grand total of 16 hours before it had to get taken down. And the larger part of the latter of those 16 hours was just Microsoft carrying out a manual exercise and trying to manage the collateral damage. So I think the industry as a whole learned quite a lot from that experiment, but from Microsoft's perspective and from the perspective of discourse around generative AI and bias, it was a bit of a harsh lesson. So now in the generative AI world, how do we actually try to mitigate against bias? How do we learn from the experience of Tay? So I'm just going to take you piece by piece through a simplified view of how generative AI models are constructed and how biases are used, how those models are protected against bias. So AI models, large language models and others usually start with large quantities of content. That content is fed into training sets and test sets. There is usually some level of filtering that takes place on that content, but it's necessarily relatively crude. So places that are known to contain heavily biased content, let's say 4chan and 8chan, things like that, are obviously being filtered out. But when we get into the meat of the actual detail that's within content, it's very hard to block that with crude filtering of the content that actually enters into the training sets. There, the operation of curation needs to be implied. So this is the exercise of going through that content and actually identifying it, describing it, and potentially weeding out other examples of bias. That used to be done by humans, but the models, in order to deliver the kinds of impressive performance that we see out of ChatGPT and others, it's now pretty much unfeasible to attempt to do human curation on those. So some level of automated curation either by other AIs or other automated systems is now the norm. There might be some level of kind of periodic checking from humans, but the curation is largely automated. And what that means in practical terms is that if there is bias in those automated systems that are doing the curation, then that bias will flow through to the training sets and the test sets. Those training sets and test sets are used to iteratively build up the model through the process of training. And we end up with some kind of large language model, for example, the GPT-4o model. And that model now needs to come into use. And this is the final protections, which is the guardrails. So hopefully we're all now fairly familiar with the typical use of a large language model or other generative AI model, wherein end users raise prompts. Those prompts go through some level of prompt engineering from the provider of that service. But there's an additional layer of prompt engineering that is applied by the model owners themselves, which is the guardrails. Those guardrails are intended to go provide that additional protection that says, look, even though the large language model might have some bias that's come through from the initial content, the filtering couldn't rule it out because it was deep within the specific items of content. The curation couldn't rule it out because it's automated and has its own built-in biases, but we can certainly check the responses, that both the prompt that comes in and the completion that comes back out for known examples of bias and use protections. So that's the way the model is intended to work, but guardrails are harder than you might think. Google had an unfortunate experience with Gemini earlier in the year in which the guardrails were applied to inquiries around photorealistic pictures of groups with known demographics like Nazis and like Vikings, and it applied its guardrails to make them ethnically diverse in ways that they never would have been. So the point being that if bias is in the system, and I think we have to assume that it's going to be, there are a bunch of protections that we can apply, but do not expect that they're going to be foolproof. So now we move on to the discussion of the notion of entrenched and secondary bias. So when bias is highly explicit, like we might see it being blocked by the filtering. So, you know, we know that 4chan and 8chan are terrible places full of the worst kinds of content. So we can certainly block those. And we know that in general circumstances, we want to represent human beings as being diverse in terms of their gender and their ethnicity. Specific cases like Vikings and Nazis aside, we know that those things take place. But entrenched and secondary bias is where there is an initial layer of bias that flows through to something that might, on the surface, not appear to be a candidate for bias. So an example, and this is a little thought exercise that the book I read encouraged people to carry out, and the author themselves had carried it out for themselves. And it's just a way of illustrating that notion of entrenched and secondary bias. And so I'd ask you to go through this thought experiment yourselves, which is to just very, very quickly think about the notion of a genius, a person that you would consider to be a genius, and think of a specific example, picture them in your mind, have a sense of who this person is, a specific person if you can, and just have that captured. And be honest, go with the first person that you think of, this is my genius. So I'd ask if anyone's come up with any names that are on this list, because the majority of people do come up with names that are from this list. The author of the book that I'm going to talk about, who's talking about a very particular kind of bias, did come up with a name off this list. And this list here that I've presented is the list that ChatGPT came up with when asked exactly that question. And you will note that is a list of, I think, 16 European or American white men, 3 European or American white women, and 1 Indian person. Nobody from Africa, nobody else from Asia. And you know, the author of this book, a very person with strong views around bias, came up with someone from this list. I came up with someone from this list. Very impressed if anyone came up with someone from this list. This is the list that you get when you ask, when you explicitly ask ChatGPT to filter for diversity and gender equality. So the point being, there's nothing inherent to the idea of genius that says, oh yeah, we expect that to be necessarily gender biased or racially biased, but it is there. And that's a very kind of trivial one. As I get into the examples from the book, which is only my next topic of conversation, we'll see how pervasive and how insidious bias can be. It worms its way into things that you might never expect. So the book in question is called Invisible Women, and it's by Carolyn Criado Perez, who is a British academic. It's written a few years ago, so it's from 2017 to 2019, that kind of era. However, I believe that it covers a wide span of history, and I believe that most of the points that it raises are still relevant today. And because of that date, it means that it predates our interest in generative AI and bias in that context, but the points that it raises are still relevant to that context. Just a little blurb about that book, so we kind of get a sense of where it's coming from. As I say, you can read that for yourself. The women that are on this book may go, yes, that is highly familiar. I know exactly where you're coming from. But for me, and I think it's also something that we should be conscious of and aware of. And I would strongly encourage anyone that likes reading to read this. I think it was a highly accessible book, targeted at a broad audience. It does get deep into the research. It does not get deep into the theory, and it does not get deep into political rhetoric. It's very much a practical book that says, look, here are some real examples of a real thing that takes place in the world, and this is what it means for human beings. So for the next little section of the presentation, I'm going to be going through some of the examples. Well, I'll start by talking about the fundamental thesis of the book, because what it really talks about is a single pattern of the way that we collect and work with data, and then it shows how that pattern plays out in a myriad of different examples. So at a fundamental level, the fundamental thesis of the book is that historical and even current data collection is influenced by bias against women. Tainted data sets underpin how we operate as a society, and it also underpins fundamental assumptions we make about every facet of life. And this is really important because there are many things in our society that we never think about. We just treat them as that's the way things are. But if we were to dig into them, we would discover very quickly that in actual fact, there is a really basic bias being applied. But the thing that is affected by the bias is now deeply entrenched in our society and very difficult to change. An observation from the book is that this is not a uniquely Western phenomenon, that you will find this thesis taking place in all cultures and all geographies. And it's not simply a question of that's annoying, there are real world consequences. But like I say, there's a core thesis and a huge collection of case studies. Generally, those are coming from peer-reviewed journals. So what is that key thesis? Well, it takes the view that the world can be divided up like this, that there are things that are specific to women, that there are things that are specific to men, and that there are things that are neutral, it doesn't make a slightest bit of difference whether you're a man or a woman or anything else. It's all the same. However, when we carry out research, we need to consider which of these categories the thing that we're researching is actually in. If it's not specific to male or female, then we can operate safely in that middle territory. But if it is, then we should be making distinctions so that the data we collect can be identified as being, it's like this for men and it's like that for women. Where it all falls apart is that we often assume things are in position, in that middle position when they in fact are not. Even when they are in that middle position, we assess it with data sets that are entirely men. And the health sector in particular is highly guilty of this. Where things are specific to sex, we'll often study them if they're in the male category, but ignore them entirely if they're in the female category. And when we look at that, the book talks about how women are different to men, because it says that it's more than a very simplistic view. Absolutely, women are different physically to men. However, this is far more than merely reproductive systems. Women's difference from men physically includes fat and muscle distribution is significantly different between women and men. Size obviously is a consideration, but perhaps above all, the endocrine system, so the hormones, is a massive difference. And this is the one that is particularly relevant for that bias in terms of the research that gets carried out in health, because the endocrine system causes a great deal of volatility in data that is collected with regard to women. And so from a researcher's perspective, it makes it that much more difficult to form a coherent thesis. But the argument, it's a pretty spurious argument, because that complexity, that volatility arising from the endocrine system, that's real. That's the reality of 50% of the population that you're studying. And so to ignore it for the sake of we can get some good results here is a fundamental problem. So when we consider the differences between men and women at a physical level, all of those things need to be considered. There has even been studies that show that sex difference can be measured at a cellular level, that we can review individual cells and identify differences that can be linked to sex. However, physical differences are only one of the three key differentiators between men and women that the author raises. The second one that she talks about is that women overwhelmingly carry the burden of unpaid care work. And unpaid care work, if it were measured in GDP, which it is not, would probably be the second largest in most economies, the second largest piece of economic activity in most economies. So it's not like a triviality that can be ignored. This is a fundamental and important part of every economy that is overwhelmingly carried out by women. And obviously parenthood is one such, but the same applies in our elderly and in people with disabilities, that women overwhelmingly carry out those care responsibilities in all societies, and generally in an unpaid capacity. And the third differentiator that the author raises is that women are overwhelmingly the victims of sexual violence carried out by men. And this is quite a broad definition of sexual violence. It starts at the most, kind of low but offensive level of sexual harassment, such as wolf whistling. It works its way through workplace sexual harassment, bullying, intimidation, and all the way up to rape and femicide. And these, again, are significant impacts on economies. So the point being, here are three ways in which women are different to men and men are different to women that should all be considered when we are making a distinction of whether the thing that we are looking into, the thing that we are researching, fits in that generalized A-B space, everybody is the same, or whether it is a case where we do need to collect data that is sex disaggregated, that we are identifying differences between men and women in the data that we collect. And there is this central fallacy, and it's been pervasive and prevalent in almost all human thought up until very recent times, which is that men are the default humans. That when you study things, if you study them in relation to men, that is good enough. So I'd like to talk about some specific use cases. I've broken them down into four categories. The book has a number of different categories. Like I say, the book has dozens, if not hundreds, of examples. I'm not going to try and cover anything like all of them, just a few in each case. And they're the ones that are simplest to explain. So I'll begin by talking about the armed forces and emergency services, basically places where people are putting themselves in physical risk in relation to various things. And I'll talk about what the author calls the Henry Higgins effect. I don't know if there's any fans of musicals out there, but Henry Higgins was the protagonist in My Fair Lady. And at one point he says, when he is particularly exasperated with Eliza's responses to his attempts to refine her, he says, why can't a woman be more like a man? And in the armed forces, in the police, and in various other emergency capacities, that mindset applies. That those are roles that have been traditionally carried out by men. When women occupy those roles and have specific requirements, the response is to go, why can't a woman be more like a man? And force the woman to actually be more like a man. So I'll start with a really, really trivial one, which is, but one that's been identified in many armed forces around the world, which is that women in the armed forces suffer significantly higher incidences of hip and pelvic injuries. And digging into it, why might this be? Why are women experiencing this? Marching. Women are being forced to march in to a stride length that is designed for men. Basically, they are stretching in ways that they never had to, and for no good reason. It's perfectly feasible to march in time with a shorter stride length, and I'm not convinced it's that critical for our defence activities. The Australian Army has reduced the stride length for women. They've seen a reduced incidence of these kinds of injuries, and the world has not ended. Moving on to a more serious one. This is body armor and bulletproof vests. Many police forces order a single design of bulletproof vest or body armor, and typically that's a design that's intended for men. That body armor, when applied to a woman, because of women's breasts, it is likely to raise it to be, it's going to be uncomfortable, it's not going to fit well, but more importantly, it's going to be raised higher than it should be, exposing large amounts of the abdomen. In addition, The male-designed body armor is very heavy and bulky, and when women try to wear it, it can limit their access to other key items of equipment, such as batons, guns, handcuffs, etc. In 2018, a Spanish policewoman paid €500 for her own body armor, designed specifically for a female body. She was disciplined and ordered to revert to the standard, i.e. male, armor. In 1997, a British policewoman was stabbed to death after removing her body armor so that she could successfully operate a hydraulic ram to break open the door. 2 years later, another policewoman reported having had breast reduction surgery to mitigate the challenges of the body armor intended for men. 700 other women complained after that event, saying that they were experiencing the similar challenges, but we're now, at the time of the writing of the book, 20 years on, and it was still a major issue. Moving on to uniforms. Women were first admitted to the US military academies in 1976. Anyone care to offer a guess for when US military uniforms were designed that would accommodate women's hips and breasts? I'm not going to tease it out. It was 2011. So 30 years, no, 30 or 25, significant amount of time. So here are all examples where in the workplace, in order for a woman to be more like a man, there have been major compromises made because that assumption of men are the default humans had been applied, and it played out in the workplace. The main set of examples come from product design and cases where been designed for men with bad consequences all around. In a car crash, women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured than a man. This is despite the fact that by far the vast majority of serious car crashes, a man is going to be the driver. So that statistic plays out regardless of whether the woman is driving or the woman is in the passenger seat. Women are also 71% more likely to be moderately injured and 17% more likely to die. Why would that be? Well, the reality is that cars and car safety are designed for men. The fundamental principles of the design of the interior of cars go back many decades, and they're based around a mythical creature called the average American man. The average American man, you'll be shocked to hear, is 180 centimeters high and 70 kilos, so not like most Americans I've met recently. And they have the amazing superpower, which is the ability to represent the entirety of humankind. What this means in practical terms within a car is that in the driver's seat, the driving position is in almost all cars is both too low for women and also too far back. So in other words, it's too low for them to see over out the windscreen and too far back for them to reach the pedals when it's in its optimal or middle position. What this means in practical terms is that women adjust the seats a long way forward and a long way up the way, with the seats pushed a long way forward. This pushes them into a too high and too upright position, which is why those injuries occur. The injuries are not caught in the testing of the cars because guess what? Our testing is done with our old friend, the crash test dummy. Do you know what kind of anatomy the crash test dummy is designed around? Correct. That would be the man's anatomy. They do have a female crash test dummy. The female crash test dummy is identical to the male crash test dummy, but a little bit shorter. Reality, women are not short men. So yeah, this is an example where a thing that we've just assumed this is how things are, this is how cars are made, has very significant consequences for women, and for no particular good reason. The next example out of product design that I'd like to talk to is voice recognition. I think this one is where we start, getting the overlaps with our large language models and our generative AI and those other phenomena, because it's very much the same category. So studies show that in general, women's speech is slower and has longer vowel sounds than men. Men are likely to have shorter word duration, greater disfluency, i.e. a tendency to be non-standard in how they pronounce individual words, and men are more likely to use what would be considered sloppy pronunciations. However, the voice recognition models are trained on the available sets of recorded speech, and the available sets of recorded speech is predominantly men. That's who we have recorded. So as a result, women frequently struggle to make effective use of voice recognition. There are many recorded examples where women can get far better performance out of voice recognition by lowering their voice and by effectively imitating men. Now, in the case of Siri or the Google Assistant, those are inconveniences, but there are some professions, such as being a doctor, where that ability to use voice recognition to capture clinical notes or other pieces of information is actually critical to the advance of your career, and women are being excluded through that fundamental bias that's in the data set of recorded voice that's been used to build voice recognition systems. I think one of the most serious problems with bias is in the health sector. And I talked earlier about the way that the endocrine system impacts the way that research is carried out. But I'd like to just introduce another little thought exercise, which is I'd like you to picture in your head a person having a heart attack and kind of give some thought to what that's like. Picture that person. Where are they? Who are they? What's their experience of having a heart attack like? Once again, I'm not gonna ask for answers. I'm going to dive straight in. Chances are that the person that you've pictured having that heart attack is someone like me. A man in middle age, perhaps a little bit overweight, probably in some public setting, and they are clutching their chest and generally moaning and rolling around. So we might expect that, heart attacks is a health problem that is significantly and largely suffered by men. It's not. Men and women are both equally likely to have heart attacks, and in terms of the consequences of those heart attacks, often they are worse for women. Women in lower socioeconomic groups are in fact 25% more likely to have a heart attack than men of any income bracket. Furthermore, women are materially more likely to die following a heart attack than men are. Why? Well, there's many cases, but one is the risk prediction models are all based on populations that were at least 2/3 male. Common preventatives like aspirin that help men have been shown to actually make things worse for women, but the research was carried out on men, and so we assume that aspirin is going to be a good treatment for prevention of heart attacks. Also, women presenting with heart attacks don't have chest pain typically. They are more likely to have stomach pain, breathlessness, and nausea, which guess what? Things that women suffer from in many other conditions. There's a medical term for the way that women present with heart attacks, which is called atypical. In other words, men are typical, women not so much. And this kind of phenomenon with heart attacks is prevalent in a lot of places. So medical research is almost exclusively carried out with male test subjects. It's easier to get volunteers, but also that challenge around the endocrine system. Basically, when you collect data from women, it makes the maths a lot harder, and it makes the consistency of getting a result set a lot harder. But like I say, that's not a reason not to do it. It's a reason why it needs to be done. Medical devices are a classic. So when you're testing a medical device, often what you're looking for is what's the range for a measurement that tells us that an intervention is required. Basically, you've got a reading. If your reading is X to X plus 1,000, then you're in that danger territory. So let's get an intervention in place. But often you'll find that with women, there will be exactly that kind of range, but it'll be at X minus 500 to X plus 500. So in other words, there's a significant group of women who are not being identified as at risk because the device in question has not been tested on women to identify where their risk range actually applies. And just as one more example out of the oh, sorry, just a common thing so we were talking about that A and B and AB. So all of the examples I've given are where there's an A case, a B case, but we treat them as AB and we measure with B, i.e. we measure with men. But the other problem we have in health is that the A case, the case of things that are specific to women, often get neglected. It's common for women presenting with real and legitimate symptoms to be treated as if those symptoms were non-existent or psychological. And in particular, they will be ascribed to exactly those hormonal systems that I talked about. Fun fact, Viagra, before it was released by Pfizer, was initially showing very promising results as a treatment for PMT, menstrual tension. But regardless of those promising results, Pfizer was on the verge of pulling the research until the value of Viagra in the treatment of erectile dysfunction was discovered, and suddenly that drug received a vast amount of funding and is the huge pharmacological hit that it is today. If you were to measure the impact on our economy or on quality of life, the impact of PMT is enormous. The impact of erectile dysfunction barely existent. Another set of use cases in public life. So I'm going to use the example. I'm trying not to be deliberately political, but it's just relevant. So I'm going to throw it into the mix. So going back to the 2016 election, the example I'm going to give is around a fundamental double standard being applied to women as opposed to men, particularly in the case of women in public life. So characteristics that are deemed admirable in men are often deemed unseemly in women. And often those are precisely the traits that society purport to want in those public roles. Bernie Sanders once said, when he was running against Hillary to be the Democratic nominee, that it is not good enough for someone to say, I'm a woman, vote for me. That's not the problem. No one's actually saying that. The problem is, in fact, the exact opposite problem, which is the vast number of people in America that are saying, I will not vote for this candidate, specifically because she is a woman. In the case of Hillary Clinton, the narrative in 2016 was around the characteristic of ambition. Hillary Clinton was perceived by many commentators on all sides of the political spectrum as being an ambitious person. And this is not something that we want in our female presidential candidates. Hillary Clinton was an ex-Secretary of State and a two-time senator for New York. Sorry, two-term senator for New York. Her opponent was a failed businessman, a celebrity TV star, and had zero experience in public office. Which one was being ambitious here? No one suggested that Trump was overly ambitious, and if he were, it would not have been construed as being negative. In debates, Hillary Clinton was deemed to be rude and interruptive. Hillary Clinton interrupted Trump 17 times in debates. Trump interrupted Hillary Clinton 51 times in debate. The host, Matt Lauer, who you may know has subsequently been discharged from NBC for sexual misconduct, interrupted Hillary Clinton significantly more often than Donald Trump. Women in public positions suffer vastly more public abuse than men, and the nature of that abuse is vastly more likely to be sexual in nature. Threats of rape, threats of sexual violence are common. The book had one reference to New Zealand, and it was a study that showed that as the proportion of women in our parliament increased, the frequency of verbally aggressive and controlling language in committee meetings by male MPs also increased. In other words, and that was done using transcripts and sentiment analysis. So in other words, the reaction of more women in Parliament by men was to go on the offensive. Of course, Hillary Clinton's experiences were from 2016. Who knows?
Did wonder if you were going to put that in.
So just moving on from the book, like I say, the book was written before the most recent transformations in generative AI. How are things looking now? Well, I was looking recently at an article from last year of Bloomberg that it wasn't a scientific study, but it did carry out kind of legitimate investigations. And they carried out studies to basically do a query on the image generation capabilities within Stable Diffusion. And they were looking at, if you asked Stable Diffusion to generate 300 images of people in 14 different job categories, in which 7 of those categories were deemed high pay, high status, and 7 were deemed low pay, low status. How will it play out in terms of the racial and ethnic mix? Racial and gender mix. Because we're talking about gender, that's the one I'm gonna go with. So here we see our 7 high status roles. Those dark green blobs are the images that were identified. Basically, they carried out a manual process. So a group of journalists reviewed all of those images, making decisions on whether the person shown was deemed to be male or female, appeared to be male or female. The dark greens are the males, the pale greens are the females. And as you will see, so architects, lawyers, politicians, doctors, CEOs, judges, and engineers, overwhelmingly, then these are our high pay, high status roles, overwhelmingly male. Of the low pay, low status roles, janitors, all men, but most of the others we're getting ever increasing levels of women through to housekeepers who were deemed to be universally female. And we can say, well, maybe this is simply stable diffusion reflecting real life. So they also did a study of what the difference is between real life and what stable diffusion was showing. So there's a kind of a complicated graph, but what we're seeing there is how many more women were identified as this role compared to the number that actually are according to census information. So in other words, it was showing more dishwashers, cashiers, housekeepers, and social workers as women than are actually in the population, but not by huge amounts. But on the other direction, it was showing quite significantly larger numbers of men in these roles than women. And I think doctors is perhaps the classic, where there was a massive 32 points of difference between the percentage of doctors that were women versus the percentage of doctors that stable diffusion presented as women. So how do we deal with that? Well, perhaps we can rely on our vendors of AI systems to find ever more sophisticated ways of managing that. Or maybe not. Microsoft lays off its ethics team. Google fires their top ethicist. OpenAI has a implosion of the ethics team. So what do we do? Well, I read the book, and I'll be honest, it was quite depressing. There was case after case, each more dreadful than the last. I've given you kind of the easy ones to describe. There's a lot more in there, and they are a lot more complex, and in many cases, a lot more horrible, basically, especially when we get into that women are different to men due to sexual violence. As I was looking at all of this stuff, my e-reader showed that I was only halfway through the book. So I kind of went, oh, well, maybe the second half of the book is the good news story. Maybe the second half of the book tells me, oh, but here's some cool things that are going on. The second half of the book was, in fact, all the references. So the second half of the book was all citations, references, telling me where to go to find the data that underpinned all of the things that were said, which meant my inner optimist did not get satisfied, but it also drew attention that I think this is something real. That we can't put this down to any kind of feminist rhetoric or something notional like that. This is a real phenomenon. So what can we do? Well, there's some really basic things that we can do as individuals. There's a tendency in the workplace to assume that women are going to do what we might consider to be the drudge work. You're in a meeting, someone needs to take notes. How often is it that it's the woman that's in the meeting? Cleaning up shared areas in your workplace, relying on women to be passing messages or doing other mundane work. I'm highly privileged at Cyma to work with some incredibly talented women, and I would hate to think that I was doing these kinds of things to them, but I know that I have. And so I've tried to be conscious about not doing that. But perhaps the most important thing is just being aware, just taking this mindset and applying it when we look at data sets and going, well, here's a set of data that seems to be indicating this particular thing. Is it possible that sex difference taking in those 3 different views of it, the purely physical, the notion of that unpaid care work, and that idea of sexual violence, perpetrated by men against women in all its different levels. Do any of those things apply to this data set? And be aware of that secondary entrenched bias. Even if it doesn't appear to apply, well, what are the fundamental assumptions here? Could it be applied to those? If we take that mindset when we're examining data, we can be much more conscious of the bias. Because as I said at the start, bias is something that will always be there. It's really a question of how do we deal with it. And that's that. So now I asked if there could be questions coming up.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or anyone wants to raise their hand?
Well, waiting for the questions, but Suzanne did note, and she says, well done.
Good.
She's heard a lot of the research before, but it's typically in the forum of women trying to work through how they can change the future, and that she loves it being done in a room full of males. Also states that awareness, acknowledgement of the differences and biases moves everybody one step further to driving change together and looking forward to people's takeouts and personal actions in their orgs and scope of work and influence.
Well, thank you for those comments, because I think they are really important. When I wrote this when I read the book and when I wrote the presentation the first time round, I was highly conscious of working in a very male-dominated environment, and I always have. Right? I've worked in IT for 30-something years, and in all that time, it has been very, very skewed towards men. I had a really interesting experience at another organisation I worked for, which I won't name, but they're a very large player in the IT sector in New Zealand, and I fell into a kind of voluntary role within the diversity group where, like, I don't even know how I fell into it. I think I was kind of like the token old guy. We need someone to represent the older group. I was like, okay, whatever. And I was in there, and I'd done a bit of reading in this space, and I said, well, one of the things we could do is, like, we can't get into what people get paid, right? But we can say, this is the gender and racial diversity, because I mean, this was another organisation that was predominantly male, and whilst it was somewhat ethnically diverse, the ethnic diversity in the nature of, I guess, IT leaned towards yes, European, but also Indian and Southeast Asian men. And I said, well, like, can we measure it at some quite aggregated way and say, broadly speaking, at our top level, we've got this kind of split of sex and race, and at the next level down, it's like this. Because the other observation I made was that whilst there were many women working in that organisation, they were skewed heavily towards roles like project management and BA, and also in the kind of administrative functions within the organisation, the HR department, the finance department. And I said, well, we should be aiming to kind of get more diversity across all of those groups. And this was within a community within the organisation that was targeted with diversity. And the pushback was phenomenal. It was like, no, we can't open that can of worms. Imagine if we. I was like, this is done pretty commonly by other organisations. Why are we so defensive about it? But it surprised me. It's all.
Gavin Findley asks, when do you think bias generally evolved? Has it always existed? And is it more prevalent in some societies rather than others?
Yeah, so bias has always been there and will always be there, right? And so it boils down, right, if you, like, I haven't done a lot of reading on the anthropology of the thing, but it boils down at its most basic level to an us and them mentality that says, I want to kind of foster me and my group and be on the defensive against other things. Within your own community, that gender bias can play out in terms of, there's a whole, like, I think I'm too ignorant of the psychology of that thing to get deep into it, but it is that other than the mentality that says, in order to make my group successful, I need to push against that other group. And then that becomes more and more refined over time for the things that I've talked about in this presentation, but also racial phenomena. The second part of that around is it going to go away or is it going to change? I don't think it is, but the dial can move, and we can operate at a kind of, by acknowledging it, we can kind of rise above it and go, look, we know this bias is here, but we think it's a bad thing and we can kind of deal with it. There's an idea that says globalization and kind of globalism will have an inherent pushback against that basically, because we, in an online context in particular, we're operating at a global scale, not as individual societies, therefore we can cross those barriers. I don't see that playing out at all. We see, if anything, the move into online discourse has made this worse, because the extreme positions from whatever now can find kindred spirits from a myriad of different places. So I don't know if that answers your question, Gavin, but
yeah, thank you. Ben just said that he loved the Ziegler quote saying, like the Kitlin law, if you write down a problem, if you write it down clearly, then the matter is half solved.
Well, this is kind of like why I'm doing this presentation, right? I read this book, and I thought when I made the presentation, and also when I read the book, all my female colleagues are going, well, duh. But for me, like, quite the revelation, this is an important thing. And I thought, well, this is making me question some really important and some fundamental things. How can I spread that more widely so that other people are thinking in that way?
I think good in the AI context is very interesting, and I'm thinking, is it going to make it worse or particularly better? The problem with AI is there's no, as you say, the curation's a big problem. You have the data and you just the machine just works it out and basically trains itself and actually gives the results. And you go, well, if it's more based on real data, then there's less kind of bias being applied. But as you said, but if there's bias in the fundamental data, it could make it worse.
The observation from that Bloomberg article was that and we see this in those skews, and yes, the population as a whole is biased already, but this biases it further. So the observation was that is the case. Bear in mind that when we're talking about, so we've got here's reality, and we've got here's a representation of reality in the content that is used to train those models, which is already one level of bias, right? So here's women, let's say, well, here's representations of women online, and then the AI itself, the training, potentially layers up another level of bias. With regard to that training, there is a phenomenon that's still hotly debated around the idea of model collapse that says if you put automation fully in the training of the models, you can't do that indefinitely. At some point, it's turtles too many layers up and the whole thing collapses. There's other research saying, actually, no, there is a way to make this happen. So it's a topic to watch, right? If you're interested in AI in any form, regardless of bias, that notion of model collapse and whether models can train themselves indefinitely or not is going to be a really interesting conversation.
I think our last comment is just from Suzanne. I did a quick poll just to see these org diversity, inclusion, and equalities, and addressing bias. So it seems the woman is heading up, more women than males at the moment. So, which is a good sign. And
no, that's not the good sign. So the good sign is when the men are leaning into it and acknowledging that there's something we need to be addressing. At the moment, yeah, there's a lot of. I get a sense. Obviously, I'm from technology and in very male-dominated teams, etc. But it's typically then the women who are driving the discussion. So just sort of building on the conversation before about refreshing, Gordon, that that you're doing the research and presenting the research and really sort of raising that. I think it's really refreshing. So thank you very much. It's quite valuable in that respect.
Oh, well,
how do we get more of the conversation across the broader community?
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be doing it, but on the other hand, I'm also highly aware that I'm part of the problem, and also how is it that the guy in the ultimate winner of the privilege lottery is the one that anyone's actually listening to,
And I think it's looking at, and once again, it's on, we've got a lot more, Caucasian people in management. How do we also open up those doors and understand more about our Maori Pacifica community members, and how do we open up those opportunities and those environments where they can also thrive and grow their careers and all of that kind of stuff as well. So that, the challenge is on all of us, whether it's gender or cultural. I think there's a lot for all of us to be doing.
I 100% agree, and that was the point with that other organisation I was talking about, where I was in their diversity group. As I said, well, can we start measuring this thing? Because we're telling this happy story that we've got so many brown faces and so many women, but if you actually slice and dice it, well, the further up the tree you go, the whiter and the more male it is, right? So can we at least draw attention to that and measure it? But no, I got such pushback. It's really quite scary.
Mm.
Okay. That's it. Just all around. Other just saying thanks, and it was a very interesting topic.
Very insightful.
Very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's good.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for participating. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
really great. We'll see you at the next one.
Cheers.
Right. Thank you all.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.